Without objection.
Mr. President, my impression is that the American people are angry. And in my view, they have every right in the world to be angry. Because what we're seeing in our country today is the kind of economic suffering and pain that we have not seen in this country since the Great Depression. Recently, last week, Ben Bernanke, who is the chairman of the Federal Reserve, he said that he thought it, quote unquote, very likely that the recession had ended. I would suggest to Mr. Bernanke that before he makes statements like that, he might want to talk to the tens and tens of millions of people in this country who are suffering economically and who, in many respects, are not going to see a better days soon unless we as a Congress get our act together. Now, when you ask why the American people are angry, let me suggest to you why that is so. We went through 8 years which, in my view, were led by the worst administration in the modern history of this country. And this is what happened during those 8 years before, underlined, before the financial crisis of last year. During the Bush-Cheney administration, over 8 million Americans slipped out of the middle class and into poverty. Median household income declined by over $2,100. Over 6.5 million Americans lost their health insurance. 5.4 million manufacturing jobs disappeared, and 4 million American workers lost their pension. That's between 2000 and 2008. Mr. President, you may have seen just the other day in USA Today on their front pages just unbelievable statistics which were geared toward age groups of young American workers seeing during that 8-year period huge declines in their median family income. Now, that was before the financial crisis. As we all know, about a year ago, Secretary of the Treasury Paulson came before the United States Congress, and essentially what he said, well, I know that for 7 years we were telling you how robust and great the American economy was, but it seems we may have made a little bit of a mistake. And if you don't give us $700 billion in the next few days, it appears that the entire world's financial system might collapse. It seems we may have made a little bit of a mistake. Well, thank God the financial system of our country and the world did not collapse. But what happened on Wall Street, because of the greed, the irresponsibility, and the illegal action of a handful of CEOs at the head of these huge financial institutions, because of their action, what did happen is we have seen a most significant economic decline in this country since the 1930s. Since the beginning of the recession in December of 2007, 7.4 million Americans have lost their jobs. The official unemployment rate is 9.7%. But, Mr. President, let me give you a statistic here which I think really is enormously powerful and extremely frightening. And that is that if you count people who are officially declared as unemployed, and if you add to that number those people who have given up looking for work, who are no longer counted as unemployed, and if you add to that number those people who want to work in full-time jobs but are now working part-time jobs, what you are looking at is 26 million Americans who are unemployed or underemployed, and that, Mr. President, is 17% of working-age Americans. 17%. So as bad as the official statistic of 9.7%, the reality is a lot worse than that. And when you wonder why people are angry, well, I think when 26 million Americans are unemployed or underemployed, when millions more have lost their homes, when they have lost their pensions, when they have lost their health insurance, you know what? Those people have a right to be angry. In my view, I think we have been far too easy in terms of our response to what the people on Wall Street have done. It is beyond my comprehension that we did not begin an investigation weeks or at least months after the financial meltdown and ask what the cause of that meltdown was, who was responsible, hold them accountable, and if they broke the law, they deserve to find out what the American penal system is all about. It seems to me that what we have got to do right now, and I know there is an investigation beginning, but we need a thorough investigation. It's already very late in the process. We should have done it earlier, to start holding those people who have caused so much suffering accountable, to understand that they just can't get away with it. You know what amazes me, Mr. President, is you have a handful of people whose greed and recklessness have caused this crisis. Have you heard one of them come before the American people and say, you know what, I'm sorry. My greed, my recklessness, my illegal behavior has caused so much suffering in this country and around the world. I want to apologize to you. I haven't heard that. I have not. On the contrary, what I have heard is lobbyists all over this place and the financial institutions spending millions and millions of dollars trying to make sure that we do nothing and that they're able to continue doing what they did, the same old ball game, which caused the crisis in the first place. So the first thing that I think we need to do is a real investigation of this financial crisis. And if there are CEOs who made hundreds of millions of dollars responsible for this disaster, this financial crisis, they've got to be accountable. If they broke the law, they've got to go to jail. Second of all, in terms of real financial reform, I am more than aware that Congress has passed legislation trying to bring more transparency and integrity to the credit card industry. We have all witnessed, all of us have received those prospectus from credit card companies telling you they're going to, if you just sign on the bottom line, you're going to get 0 interest rates credit. They literally have sent out billions of these prospectus every single year. And meanwhile, in tiny print on page 4, it appears that they could raise their rates to any level they wanted for any reason that they wanted. Well, we've begun to deal with that, but we have not gone far enough. Mr. President, when major institutions, major financial institutions are charging American people 29% interest rates on their credit cards, 30% interest rates in terms of payday lending, 40, 50% interest rates, we got to call it for what it is. That is loan sharking. You know, in the old days, what a loan shark was is somebody, some crook who lent you money, and if you didn't pay it back on time, they broke your kneecaps. Now we got these guys on Wall Street who are doing exactly the same thing, and we call that, you know, providing credit, but it's not. It is loan sharking, it is usury, and we need to bring back usury legislation in this country, which we used to have, but was done away with by a Supreme Court decision which allowed companies that go to states that don't have usury laws to be protected in terms of being able to charge high interest rates all over the country. Now, I have introduced legislation which imposes a maximum of 15% interest on credit cards. And the reason that I've done that is, in fact, credit unions for many decades now have been operating under that law. And you know what? It's not the credit unions who are coming here for massive bailouts. It's our friends on Wall Street. So I think if it's worked for the credit unions, it can work for private banks as well. So I think what we have got to do is we passed credit card legislation, which is a step forward, but I think we've got to take it another big step, and we have got to say that there has to be a maximum, a cap on interest rates, and I think an appropriate one is 15%. Another issue that I think we have to deal with is this phenomenon of too big to fail. The reason that we provided hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in bailouts to Wall Street is that the experts believe, the Secretary of Treasury and the head of the Fed believed, that if we allowed these huge financial institutions to fail, they would bring down the entire system. Well, that was a year ago. And maybe you know more than I do, but I'm not aware that we have taken any steps to begin breaking up these large financial institutions. If they were too big to fail a year ago, they're too big to fail right now. And in fact, what we have seen, and there have been a number of articles on this, is that these huge financial institutions, if anything, in the last year have become even larger. Now, what sense is that? So I think we have to begin to learn what Teddy Roosevelt did 100 years ago, and we've got to start breaking these guys up, because if we don't, we're going to be back here again, except next time the bailout will be even larger, because the financial crisis will be that much more severe. Furthermore, it goes without saying that for years, Alan Greenspan and Bob Rubin and all of those people who told us that the secret to financial success in America was to deregulate Wall Street, that what we really had to do was to get the government off of the backs of all of these big Wall Street companies. We had to we had to do away with the Glass-Steagall legislation. We had to allow investment houses to merge with commercial banks, to merge with insurance companies, and all of that was really going to be wonderful in terms of creating wealth and prosperity for the American people. Well, our friends on Wall Street spend billions of dollars in lobbying to get that through. When I was in the House, I was one of those who vigorously opposed that approach. But I think, needless to say, it is time to rethink that, and in a sensible way to start the re-regulation of Wall Street. Look, the bottom line is, these people on Wall Street are by and large concerned about one thing, and that is making as much money as they possibly can for themselves, and they have done phenomenally well in that regard. Some years ago, 25% of all of the profits in America went to Wall Street, which has relatively few people. And obviously, as I think everybody knows, you had hedge fund guys making $1 billion in a year, CEOs of these institutions making hundreds of millions of dollars a year. They have done very, very well. That's what they do. They don't care that manufacturing is disintegrating in America, that millions of workers have lost their manufacturing jobs. They don't care that small businesses can't get credit. They don't care about trying to build a productive economy where our working people are producing real products that people can consume. That's not where these guys are at. They are at it for one reason: short-term gains. And if anyone believes otherwise, I think you don't understand history. So I think we have got to set out a number of rules by which they have got to play by, or else we're looking to bring back exactly what we just went through. Another issue that I think we have to deal with as we get to financial reform is the Fed. I am a member of the Budget Committee, and last year, when Mr. Bernanke, chairman of the Fed, came before the committee, I asked him very simply if he could tell me which financial institutions were the recipients of some $2 trillion in zero-interest loans. Now, during the financial crisis, Mr. Bernanke and the Fed provided $2 trillion, that's with the T, not a million, not a billion, $8 trillion, $2 trillion to large financial institutions. I asked them a pretty simple question, I think, as the United States Senator: can you please tell me which financial institutions received that money? I don't think that's a terribly radical question, putting $2 trillion of taxpayers' money at risk. And he said, no, can't tell you, can't tell you. Well, on that particular day, I introduced legislation that would make him tell us. Because I think it is beyond comprehension that we are putting at risk trillions of dollars going to institutions, and we don't know who they are, we don't know what kind of conflicts of interest exist, we don't know what the terms of payment are. It is beyond comprehension. And on this issue, I must confess, I am working with somebody whose politics and ideology is very different than mine. That's my old friend Ron Paul, who is a very, very conservative Republican in the House. Ron and I worked on some issues when I was in the House, and he and I are working together on two pieces of legislation on the Fed, but one of them is going to tell the Fed that, sorry, you just can't give away trillions of dollars with the American people not knowing what it is. So we need an audit of the Fed, we need transparency in the Fed, we need accountability in the Fed. There is another issue that we want to deal with, and that is oil speculation. I come from a cold weather state. Many people heat with oil. And obviously, all over this country, people are filling up their gas tanks to get to work. And we have reason to believe that one of the causes of the volatility in oil prices has to do with speculation coming from Wall Street, where our friends there are investing in oil futures. And I think we have got to begin to control that speculation so that people are not paying outrageous prices, heating their homes in the winter or filling up their gas tanks. And lastly, the issue of Wall Street, in one sense, is not radically different from the issue of health care or many other important issues, and that is the power, the incredible power that these special interests have. Mr. President, the banking and insurance industries have spent over $5 billion on campaign contributions and lobbying activities over the past decade in support of deregulation, and they are spending even more to try to prevent Congress from seriously regulating their industries. The American people want change. They want Congress to reform Wall Street. They want those people who caused this economic crisis to be held accountable. They want to make sure that we prevent us from ever going into a situation like we were in last year. Whether we can do it remains to be seen, given the power of Wall Street and the incredible amounts of money they spend on campaign contributions and on lobbying, which brings us to the issue of campaign finance reform and my strong view that we need public funding of elections. So, Mr. President, I just did want to say a word as to my perception of why the American people are angry, the fact that they have every reason in the world to be angry, because in our great country what we are seeing for the first time in our lifetimes is the real likelihood that our kids will have a lower standard of living than our generation. And that is not something that we should be happy about. We have got to ask the questions why. We have got to ask what policies contributed to that decline of the middle class, that increase in poverty. We have to ask why we are the only country in the world that doesn't have a national health care program guaranteeing health care to all people, why we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth, why we have the greatest gap between the rich and everybody else of any major country on earth. We've got to ask those questions. And we need to stand up to powerful special interest in bringing about the kinds of reforms that we need. Thank you very much, Mr. President, and with that, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.